Picture the year 1717. The Caribbean air hangs heavy with the smell of wet hemp rope, rotting oak planks soaked in bilge water, and the sharp mineral sting of black powder residue that never fully leaves a ship's gun deck. A merchant brigantine of approximately 180 tons burthen pitches violently against Atlantic swells, somewhere between Nassau and Port Royal, while the lookout perched 70 feet above the waterline, inside the topmast. Crosstrees suddenly screams the single word every sailor feared more than plague, hurricane, or starvation: pirates. Immediately the geometry of survival changes aboard the vessel. Men hauling braces on the quarterdeck freeze as they see dark triangular silhouettes emerging from morning fog, lateen sails trimmed for pursuit, hulls riding low from stolen cargo, and heavy bronze culverins mounted behind open gun ports. These pirate vessels are not the romantic fantasies painted centuries later. Their hulls stink of infected wounds, salted beef crawling with maggots, sulfur smoke, human sweat fermented beneath wool jackets soaked continuously with seawater, and the sour reek of unwashed bodies trapped for months inside cramped forecastles where humidity softened timber and encouraged colonies of black mold across the beams. The merchant captain understands the mathematics instantly. His ship carries sugar, indigo, and 43 barrels of silver coin minted in Veracruz. But more importantly, it carries people, and pirates rarely considered people valuable, except as labor, ransom, or entertainment. Within minutes, sailors begin making calculations far more horrifying than combat itself. Because beyond the railing, beneath turquoise water, sparkling under tropical sunlight, another danger circles constantly through the warm currents of the Caribbean basin: sharks. Sailors of the early 18th century knew sharks intimately. They called them sea devils, blue death, or simply the waiting mouths. Crews watched them trail slave ships for thousands of miles across the Atlantic, feeding upon corpses thrown overboard during outbreaks of dysentery, yellow fever, and scurvy. Sailors cleaning fish off the stern rails often saw entire schools of requiem sharks materialize from seemingly empty ocean within seconds after blood touched water. Anatomically, these predators were terrifyingly efficient. The Caribbean reef shark possessed rows of serrated teeth capable of exerting pressure exceeding several thousand newtons per square inch, enough to shear through femurs, split rib cages, and strip flesh from bodies before drowning even occurred. Yet despite knowing this, men repeatedly chose the sharks. To understand why requires stepping inside the legal and psychological machinery of piracy itself. A pirate boarding was not simply theft. It was ritualized terror designed to collapse resistance before combat even began. Pirate captains such as Edward Teach deliberately weaponized appearance. Teach braided slow-burning cannon fuses into his beard, so sulfurous smoke curled around his face like hellfire during battle. Witnesses described glowing embers illuminating his eyes beneath a broad hat, while pistols hung across his chest from bandoliers holding 6 or more loaded weapons simultaneously. Pirate articles of agreement often granted compensation for lost limbs measured in pieces of 8, meaning crews accepted violence as contractual inevitability. Captured sailors understood exactly what awaited them because maritime rumor spread faster than official news. Ports from Tortuga to Barbados circulated stories of floggings performed with the cat-o'-nine tails until vertebrae became visible beneath shredded muscle tissue. Victims described keel hauling, a punishment where men were dragged beneath a ship's hull covered in barnacles whose calcium carbonate shells acted like serrated blades, slicing skin to ribbons while victims inhaled seawater and blood simultaneously. Other captives were marooned on isolated sandbars with only a pistol containing one shot, forcing impossible decisions between dehydration, madness, or suicide. Some pirates preferred slower methods. Captains accused of hiding valuables had burning matches inserted beneath fingernails or between toes. Surgeons aboard pirate ships, when they existed at all, worked with rusted amputation saws lacking sterilization, meaning even survivable injuries frequently produced gangrene. The average sailor knew these details not from legend, but from direct observation. Many had seen survivors stumble into colonial ports, missing ears, noses, fingers, or entire jaws shattered by pistol shot. Against this reality, the ocean itself began appearing merciful. Trace your finger along the shipping lanes, stretching from Havana through the Windward Passage and toward the Atlantic approaches of Charleston, and you begin understanding why shark-infested waters became theaters of desperate human calculation. Merchant sailors in the Golden Age of Piracy occupied perhaps the harshest labor environment on Earth, outside slavery itself. A typical merchantman of 250 tons displacement carried crews sleeping inside spaces barely 4 feet high, where condensation dripped continuously from deck beams coated in pine tar and whale oil sealant. Diet consisted primarily of hardtack biscuits, so dense they often required soaking in brine or rum before chewing. Salted pork preserved inside barrels breeding weevils, and stagnant water stored in casks whose interiors accumulated algae, bacteria, and insect larvae. Scurvy softened gums until teeth loosened and fell onto deck planking during meals. Rats spread typhus through lower decks, while cockroaches nested inside bedding stuffed with damp straw. Under these conditions, pirates represented not merely criminals, but inverted mirrors of maritime society. Many pirate crews originally consisted of abused merchant sailors who mutinied after years of brutal discipline under naval or commercial captains enforcing order through violence. Ironically, pirate ships often distributed plunder more equally than legitimate merchant companies distributed wages. Yet equality within pirate crews did not translate into mercy toward captives. Maritime warfare during the 17th and 18th centuries operated within systems of terror economics. Violence communicated reputation, and reputation determined surrender rates. A pirate vessel surviving through intimidation avoided costly cannon exchanges capable of splintering hulls below the waterline. Therefore, pirates cultivated reputations deliberately exaggerated through tavern stories, survivor testimonies, and theatrical cruelty. Consider the physics of boarding combat itself. When pirate sloops closed distance, using favorable wind angles and lighter hull designs, grappling hooks attached to hemp lines weighing several pounds, each slammed into enemy railings. Boarders carrying boarding axes, cutlasses forged from high-carbon steel, and flintlock pistols surged across narrow gangplanks, slick with seawater and blood. Gunpowder smoke rapidly obscured visibility because black powder combustion generated dense clouds of potassium sulfate, potassium carbonate, and sulfur residue. Inside this chemical fog, combat became intensely personal. Cutlasses designed with curved blades approximately 30 inches long, optimized slashing within confined decks. Bone fragments, shattered teeth, and splinters from oak bulwarks transformed into secondary projectiles. Surgeons later described wounds containing wood fibers driven inches into flesh by musket impacts. Merchant sailors understood that surviving surrender offered no guarantee of life afterward. Pirates frequently forced skilled navigators, carpenters, coopers, and surgeons into service. Refusal could mean immediate execution. Acceptance meant becoming legally damned. Under British Admiralty law, piracy constituted hostis humani generis, an enemy of all mankind. Captured pirates faced hanging at execution dock, where bodies were coated in tar and suspended in iron gibbet cages beside tidal rivers as warnings. Thus, sailors confronting pirate attack often perceived only three outcomes: torture, forced piracy, followed eventually by execution, or the sea. Contemporary journals repeatedly mention men leaping overboard despite visible sharks. During the 1721 capture of several merchant vessels near the Bahamas, witnesses reported sailors diving directly into waters alive with monstrous fish, rather than submit to boarding parties notorious for mutilating prisoners. One must remember these sailors possessed intimate experiential knowledge of sharks. They watched oceanic whitetips follow ships for weeks, their dorsal fins slicing water with terrifying patience. Sailors cleaning chamber pots over railings sometimes saw sharks consume refuse before it fully sank. Yet there existed another psychological dimension. Drowning, though horrifying, retained elements of chance and personal agency. Pirate captivity removed both. The ocean might kill quickly. Pirates often killed slowly. This distinction mattered profoundly to exhausted men already living at the edge of mortality. Maritime culture normalized death through storms, disease, mast collapses, cannon accidents, and falls from rigging. Sailors expected random death. What they feared was humiliation preceding death. Pirate torture transformed men into spectacles. Contemporary depositions describe captives stripped naked, tied to masts, whipped with ropes knotted around lead shot, or forced to watch executions before facing their own interrogation. Under such conditions, even shark-filled water began resembling escape. Picture the construction of the ships themselves, because the architecture of wooden sailing vessels intensified every terror associated with pirate attack. An 18th century merchant frigate relied upon a skeleton composed of futtocks, floor timbers, keelsons, and transverse frames, fastened together using thousands of iron spikes, vulnerable to corrosion from saltwater intrusion. Hull planking built from white oak or live oak measured several inches thick near the waterline. Yet cannon fire transformed this timber into lethal fragmentation devices. When an 18-pound iron cannonball, traveling at velocities exceeding 1,500 feet per second, struck a hull, the projectile rarely produced neat holes. Instead, kinetic energy exploded wood fibers inward, creating razor-sharp splinters capable of amputating limbs or penetrating internal organs. Naval surgeons considered splinter wounds especially deadly because timber fragments carried bacteria deep into tissue where infection flourished. During pirate engagements, merchant sailors therefore faced environments becoming mechanically disassembled around them. Masts cracked with sounds resembling artillery barrages. Standing rigging snapped under immense tension, whipping through decks hard enough to decapitate men instantly. Blocks and tackle, weighing dozens of pounds, fell from spars towering more than 100 feet overhead. Amid such chaos, pirate captains intentionally targeted psychological weak points. Rather than immediately sink prey, many aimed chain shot or bar shot at rigging to immobilize vessels while preserving cargo. This prolonged terror. Merchant crews trapped aboard crippled ships watched pirate vessels maneuver deliberately closer while drums beat and black flags climbed mastheads. The infamous Jolly Roger itself functioned as psychological warfare technology. Symbols depicting skeletons, bleeding hearts, or hourglasses communicated clear messages: surrender immediately or suffer exemplary violence. Accounts from surviving captains repeatedly mention crew members panicking upon sight of certain pirate ensigns, specifically associated with reputations for torture. Among the most feared were crews operating from Nassau after 1715, where hundreds of former privateers unemployed following the War of the Spanish Succession turned to piracy. These men possessed military combat experience, understood naval tactics, and carried profound resentment toward merchant authorities who withheld wages or abandoned disabled sailors without compensation. Pirate ships often sailed faster than merchantmen because they sacrificed cargo capacity for maneuverability. Sleek sloops with shallow drafts could navigate reefs and shoals impossible for heavier commercial vessels, allowing pirates to ambush targets near islands where sharks congregated around warm currents, rich in fish populations. Sailors knew these waters intimately. Caribbean harbors teemed with tiger sharks, reaching lengths over 15 feet and weighing more than 1,400 pounds. Biological efficiency made them especially feared scavengers. Their serrated dentition evolved to slice through turtle shells, whale carcasses, and human bone alike. Yet maritime folklore sometimes portrayed sharks as cleaner deaths than pirates. Sailors believed drowning victims lost consciousness relatively quickly after hypoxia reduced oxygen supply to the brain, whereas pirate torture could extend for days. Whether medically accurate mattered less than perception. Fear operates through imagination amplified by rumor, and pirate violence generated limitless rumor. Consider the notorious punishment called sweating. Captives suspected of concealing valuables were tied near galley fires beneath tropical heat, while deprived of water, until delirium produced confession or death. Others endured Moses' Law, receiving 40 lashes minus 1, using braided cords capable of stripping skin entirely from backs. Pirate surgeons occasionally amputated fingers joint by joint, searching for hidden rings. Merchant sailors, hearing such stories while staring across open water at approaching black sails, confronted primal neurological conflict. The human brain measures threat, not solely through mortality probability, but through anticipated suffering and loss of dignity. Sharks represented impersonal predation. Pirates represented conscious cruelty. This distinction explains numerous eyewitness reports describing men praying briefly before jumping overboard during attacks. Some attempted to cling to floating spars or empty casks, hoping currents might carry them beyond pursuit. Others simply vanished beneath waves immediately. Pirate crews occasionally laughed while watching. In several documented cases, they fired muskets into water at fleeing sailors for sport. Yet even then, men jumped. The ocean at least offered uncertainty. Pirate decks offered certainty. Picture the sensory environment beneath the tropical sun during the exact moment a sailor decided to abandon ship. Tar softened across deck seams under temperatures exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Salt crystals formed white deposits across hemp ropes thick as a man's wrist. The air tasted metallic from cannon smoke drifting low across water because black powder combustion released sulfur dioxide and microscopic carbon particles coating tongues and throats. Somewhere nearby, a wounded sailor screamed with the wet, choking sound associated with punctured lungs, while carpenters below deck hammered emergency plugs into hull breaches using oakum and pitch. Above this chaos towered pirate vessels rigged for intimidation. Their sails often appeared dark, not because fabric itself was black, but because years of tar waterproofing stained canvas brownish gray. Pirates favored multiple swivel guns mounted along railings, small caliber weapons firing grape shot or scrap metal devastating against exposed personnel. Grapeshot functioned essentially as gigantic shotgun ammunition. Canvas bags packed with iron balls burst upon firing, scattering lethal projectiles across decks where human bodies packed tightly around guns and rigging offered perfect targets. Merchant sailors struck by grapeshot sometimes lost entire sections of face or abdomen instantly. Naval medicine lacked anesthetics beyond alcohol or opium tinctures. Amputation remained standard treatment for shattered limbs, performed using bone saws wiped quickly between patients. Under these conditions, fear accumulated physically inside crews long before boarding began. Maritime records from Admiralty courts contain astonishingly detailed testimony regarding pirate cruelty, because survivors were later interrogated extensively by authorities. One deponent described captives having ears nailed to masts before execution. Another recounted pirates forcing prisoners to dance barefoot across heated galley plates while being cut with knives whenever movement slowed. Whether every story proved factual almost becomes irrelevant because sailors believed them. Fear transformed pirate reputations into self-sustaining weapons. Interestingly, sharks themselves occupied contradictory roles within maritime culture. Sailors simultaneously feared and respected them. Many believed sharks possessed supernatural awareness of death. Whaling crews reported sharks appearing hours before corpses entered water, following ships with uncanny persistence. Anatomically, the oceanic white-tip shark particularly suited this role. Its enormous pectoral fins allowed energy-efficient cruising across open seas, while highly developed olfactory systems detected blood concentrations as low as 1 part per 10 billion. During shipwrecks, these predators became infamous for circling survivors patiently until exhaustion reduced defensive movement. Yet sailors also observed that shark attacks could be sudden and efficient compared with human cruelty. A massive bite-severing femoral arteries caused hypovolemic shock within minutes. Pirate torture, meanwhile, intentionally prolonged agony. Consider also the legal implications facing captured crews. Maritime law distinguished sharply between lawful privateering under letters of marque and outright piracy. However, in practice, these boundaries blurred constantly. A sailor forcibly recruited into piracy still faced execution if later captured aboard pirate vessels. Courts rarely accepted coercion defenses. Therefore, surrendering alive sometimes meant eventual hanging, regardless. Execution Dock in London became infamous for tidal hangings, where condemned pirates remained suspended long enough for 3 tides to wash over bodies before burial. Corpses displayed publicly inside iron cages along riverbanks warned future sailors against piracy, while simultaneously reminding merchant crews what awaited anyone unable to escape pirate capture. Some sailors therefore viewed suicide by sea as preserving moral agency. Religious dimensions intensified these decisions. Many maritime cultures considered dying freely preferable to becoming complicit in piracy through forced service. Chaplains aboard naval vessels preached that pirates existed outside divine law entirely, creatures morally equivalent to demons. When confronted with such existential framing, shark-infested waters paradoxically appeared cleaner than pirate decks stained with torture and mutiny. During the 1722 capture of a Portuguese merchantman near Cuba, survivors later testified that several crew members cast themselves into ye sea among ye sharks, rather than abide ye torment threatened. The phrasing matters profoundly. These men were not ignorant of sharks. They explicitly acknowledged them. Yet pirate torment outweighed even primal fear of predation. This reveals extraordinary psychological conditions produced by Golden Age piracy. Human beings generally avoid known lethal environments instinctively. Choosing shark waters required overwhelming alternative horror. Pirate violence supplied precisely that horror through deliberate cultivation of unpredictability, humiliation, and prolonged suffering. Trace your finger along the scarred hull of a preserved 18th century sailing vessel and examine the physical reality of life aboard pirate ships themselves, because unders.